It was in the autumn of 1978 when 24-year-old Martha Gaines made a decision that would forever alter the landscape of her rural Kentucky county. The air that October was thick with the smell of drying corn stalks and the bitter tang of impending frost. But the atmosphere in the gravel lot of the old Miller farm was heavy with something else entirely. It was heavy with the quiet, suffocating weight of failure. The regional bank had foreclosed on the Miller family, a tragedy that was becoming a familiar shadow over the valley in those days, and the bankers were holding a strict liquidation event to recoup whatever pennies they could extract from the dirt. There was no auctioneer with a fast-talking cadence to whip up excitement, no competitive bidding to drive up prices, and no sense of community gathering. Instead, men from the city, wearing tailored suits that had no business being near a muddy pasture, stood around with clipboards and cold eyes. Every single item on the farm, from the massive grain silos down to the rusted hand tools in the crumbling shed, had a stiff cardboard tag tied to it with a piece of twisted wire. On each tag was a fixed price, written in thick, uncompromising black ink. You either paid the price written on the card, or you walked away empty-handed. It was a cold, clinical way to dismantle a family's multi-generational legacy, and the local farmers who had come to spectate walked through the rows of machinery with their hands shoved deep into their pockets, speaking only in hushed, reverent whispers. At the very back of the property, far away from the shiny plows and the well-maintained combine harvesters that the wealthier men were inspecting, sat the graveyard of the farm. Here, half buried in a tangle of overgrown blackberry brambles and tall, dry weeds, sat 5 abandoned tractors. They were hulking beasts of iron and steel, painted a faded, chalky red that had long since surrendered to the creeping orange bloom of rust. The tires were cracked and flat, sinking into the soft earth as if the machines were trying to return to the soil that had birthed them. The exhaust stacks were rusted through, and the engine compartments were choked with old bird nests and dried leaves. To the untrained eye, to the men who gathered in that dusty yard who had been trading machinery since before Martha was a thought, these tractors were nothing more than a nuisance. They were scrap metal, heavy and useless, a testament to deferred maintenance and mechanical despair. The cardboard tag wired to the front grille of the lead tractor read $1,000 for the entire lot of 5. Martha Gaines stood before them, a solitary figure in a faded denim jacket and heavy leather work boots. She did not look at the machines with pity, nor did she look at them with the casual dismissal of the men around her. She looked at them the way a doctor looks at a patient in a coma. She walked slowly down the line, her hands grazing the cold, rough iron of the engine blocks. She paused at the 3rd tractor, crouching down in the mud to inspect the underside of the transmission housing. She ran her thumb over a specific heavy bolt, wiping away decades of accumulated grease and grime, her eyes narrowing as she confirmed what she was seeing. Let me tell you about the men who were watching her. The local farmers, men whose families had worked that Kentucky soil for 100 years, leaned against their pickup trucks and watched the young woman with a mixture of amusement and pity. But the loudest among them was Harlan Vance. Harlan was the owner of the largest agricultural equipment dealership in 3 counties. He was a man who made his living selling shiny new machines on steep credit, convincing men that progress meant signing their lives away to high-interest loans. He stood near the bank representatives, a cigar clamped between his teeth, radiating the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he held the keys to the future of farming. When Martha walked up to the bank representative and pulled a thick envelope of cash from her jacket pocket, counting out exactly $1,000 in worn, crumpled bills, a heavy silence fell over the yard. The banker looked at the money, then looked at Martha, raising a skeptical eyebrow. He asked if she possessed the means to haul the scrap iron away, noting that the bank wanted the property cleared by the end of the week. Martha simply nodded, handing over the money and taking the signed receipt. That was when Harlan Vance laughed. It was a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the empty silos. He stepped forward, projecting his voice so every farmer in the lot could hear him. He told Martha that she had just spent her life savings on the heaviest paperweights in the state of Kentucky. He declared, with the absolute certainty of conventional wisdom, that those engines had seized up 5 years ago, that the transmissions were shattered beyond repair, and that the only thing those machines were good for was melting down to make horseshoes. The crowd of farmers chuckled along with him, shaking their heads at the foolishness of a young woman trying to play a man's game with broken toys. Martha did not argue. She did not raise her voice, nor did she attempt to defend her purchase. She carefully folded the receipt, placed it in her pocket, looked Harlan Vance directly in the eye for a single, silent moment, and walked away. She knew something they did not. To understand Martha Gaines, you must first understand the man who raised her. Her father, Elias Gaines, was not a wealthy man, nor was he a man who cared for the opinions of the town. He was a master mechanic, a man who possessed a quiet, almost mystical connection to the machinery that powered the agricultural world. While other men replaced broken parts with expensive new ones, Elias repaired them. He believed that metal had a memory, that an engine would tell you exactly what was wrong with it if you only had the patience to listen. Elias had raised Martha alone in a small, drafty farmhouse at the edge of the county, spending more time in his cavernous, oil-stained workshop than in the house itself. From the time she was old enough to hold a wrench, Martha was by his side. She did not learn through formal lectures or textbooks. She learned through the silent communion of shared labor. She learned to diagnose a failing water pump by the subtle change in its vibration. She learned to identify the exact alloy of a gear by the color of the sparks it threw against a grinding wheel. Elias taught her that debt was a storm that would eventually wash away everything a person built, and that true independence came from the ability to maintain and repair the things you owned. When Elias passed away suddenly the winter before the Miller farm liquidation, he left Martha with no money, no land of her own, and no standing in the community. But he left her something far more valuable than a bank account. He left her his workshop, his meticulously cared-for tools, and, most importantly, his journals. These were not ordinary diaries. They were a towering stack of thick, leather-bound ledgers, filled edge to edge with Elias's cramped, precise handwriting. For 40 years, Elias had documented every machine he had ever touched. He recorded the factory defects that the manufacturers tried to hide. He noted the exact tolerances of engine valves, the peculiar weaknesses of specific hydraulic systems, and the unconventional workarounds he had invented to keep doomed machines running. It was a localized encyclopedia of mechanical truth, a grimoire of industrial secrets that existed nowhere else on Earth. And it was within those pages that Martha had found the truth about the 5 abandoned tractors. The conventional wisdom, loudly preached by Harlan Vance and accepted by every farmer in the valley, was that this specific model of tractor suffered from a catastrophic transmission failure. After a few thousand hours of use, they would lock up entirely, rendering the machine a total loss. Because the replacement parts were prohibitively expensive, the tractors were simply abandoned in fields and fence rows. But Elias Gaines had discovered the lie. Years ago, a desperate farmer had brought one of these locked-up tractors to Elias. Through weeks of patient, methodical teardown, Elias had discovered that the transmission itself was perfectly fine. The issue was a microscopic 50-cent bypass valve in the hydraulic governor pump that would stick open, flooding the transmission housing with pressurized fluid and hydraulically locking the gears. It looked like a catastrophic failure. It felt like a catastrophic failure, but it was nothing more than a stuck valve. Elias had documented the exact procedure to bypass the faulty valve, clean the housing, and restore the tractor to perfect working order for less than $10 in parts. Martha had memorized that journal entry. When she looked at those 5 rusted hulks sinking into the Miller farm mud, she did not see scrap metal. She saw 5 perfectly good engines, trapped in a mechanical coma, waiting for someone with the knowledge to wake them up. The subsequent 2 months were a masterclass in solitary endurance. Martha hired a local tow truck driver, paying him the last of her meager savings, to drag the 5 heavy machines out of the mud and deposit them in the overgrown yard in front of her father's workshop. The community watched the procession of rusted iron moving down the county highway with bemused skepticism. The whispers flowed through the local diner and the feed store. They said Martha Gaines had finally lost her mind with grief over her father, that she was building a monument to foolishness in her front yard. Martha ignored the whispers. She retreated into the quiet sanctuary of the workshop and began the long, brutal work of resurrection. The winter of 1978 was unusually cruel. The wind howled down through the valley, rattling the tin roof of the workshop and driving the bitter cold deep into the concrete floor. Martha worked alone, illuminated by the harsh glare of a single halogen work light. She wore 3 layers of clothing, her breath pluming in the freezing air as she wrestled with bolts that had been rusted solid for a decade. She started with the lead tractor. It was a grueling, filthy process. She had to drain gallons of contaminated, waterlogged oil that smelled of rot and neglect. She had to painstakingly disassemble the fuel delivery system, soaking the delicate carburetor jets in harsh solvents to dissolve the varnished remains of ancient gasoline. Her hands were perpetually stained black, the skin cracked and bleeding from the cold and the constant exposure to harsh chemicals. There were nights when her muscles screamed in protest, when the sheer physical weight of the iron parts seemed impossible for her to manage alone. It was during one of these brutal nights in late January that she faced her deepest moment of private doubt. She was attempting to reseat the heavy cast iron hydraulic pump, a crucial step in her father's documented fix. She was exhausted, her fingers numb, and the heavy component slipped, pinching her hand against the engine block. The pain was sudden and blinding. She dropped her wrench, sinking to the freezing concrete floor, clutching her bleeding hand to her chest. In the oppressive silence of the cold workshop, surrounded by the skeletal remains of dismantled machinery, the weight of her isolation crashed down upon her. She was 24 years old, entirely broke, freezing, and attempting a task that every expert in the county had declared impossible. The arrogant laughter of Harlan Vance echoed in her memory. For a long, dangerous moment, she considered turning off the halogen light, walking back to the house, and surrendering to the conventional wisdom. But the workshop remembered her father, and so did she. She looked up at the workbench, where the leather-bound ledger sat open to the specific page detailing the hydraulic bypass. She saw her father's precise handwriting, the tangible proof of a lifetime of patient observation. She remembered his voice, rough as sandpaper, telling her that the iron does not care about opinions, it only cares about the truth. Martha bound her bruised hand with a clean rag, picked up her wrench from the concrete, and went back to work. 2 weeks later, the valley experienced a brief, unexpected thaw. The snow melted into thick, sucking mud, and the air carried the first faint, deceptive promise of spring. Inside the workshop, Martha stood beside the reassembled lead tractor. She had installed a fresh battery, primed the fuel lines, and double-checked every single tolerance against the ledger. She climbed into the cracked leather operator's seat and turned the ignition key. The starter motor whined, a high, desperate sound in the quiet barn. The engine turned over slowly, fighting against the stiff, cold oil. It coughed once, a sharp crack like a rifle shot, and then fell silent. Martha did not panic. She adjusted the choke, waited exactly 10 seconds, and turned the key again. This time, the heavy diesel engine caught. It roared to life with a deafening percussive thunder that rattled the wrenches on the pegboard and shook the dust from the rafters. A thick plume of black smoke shot from the exhaust stack, clearing the cylinders of a decade of stagnation before settling into a smooth, powerful, rhythmic idle. The tractor was alive. The seized transmission was a myth. The machine was whole. Martha sat in the vibrating seat, her grease-stained hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, and allowed herself a small, solitary smile. The first battle was won, but the war for her independence had just begun. By the time spring truly arrived in 1979, the agricultural landscape of the county was beginning to shift. The planting season was upon them, bringing with it the intense, time-sensitive pressure that defined a farmer's life. It was also the beginning of an era of easy credit. Harlan Vance was having a record year at his dealership, convincing farmers to finance massive, computerized tractors with enclosed cabs and air conditioning. The local bank was handing out agricultural loans like candy, and the farmers were taking them, betting their family land on the promise of higher yields and perpetual good weather. Martha watched this frenzy of debt from the quiet borders of her property. She had restored the second tractor by early April, parking it next to the first in her yard. They were not shiny. They lacked air conditioning and radios, but they were mechanically flawless, stripped of their rust, painted with a tough, utilitarian primer, and they were entirely paid for. Her opportunity arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in the form of Elias Henderson, an older farmer who ran a modest operation on the rocky soil at the north end of the valley. Mr. Henderson drove his battered pickup truck into Martha's yard, looking pale and desperate. His primary tractor, a newer model he had purchased from Harlan Vance 3 years prior, had suffered a catastrophic failure in the middle of preparing his fields for planting. When he called the dealership, Vance informed him that the repair would take 3 weeks and cost more than Henderson could possibly afford, casually suggesting that Henderson simply trade the broken machine in and finance an even larger, more expensive replacement. Henderson could not afford more debt. His fields were turning to mud, his planting window was closing, and he was facing ruin. He had heard the rumors that Elias Gaines's daughter had managed to get one of the scrapyard tractors running. He came to her, not out of confidence, but out of absolute desperation. He asked if he could rent her tractor for the week. Martha looked at the desperate man, then looked at her restored machines. She realized in that moment that her business was not going to be farming the land herself. Her business was going to be the salvation of those who could not afford to play Harlan Vance's game. She told Henderson that she did not rent her equipment. Instead, she offered him a contract. She would bring her tractor to his farm, she would operate it herself, and she would pull his implements to prepare his fields. She would charge him a flat hourly rate for her labor in the machine, a rate that was fair and payable only when the job was done. Furthermore, she offered to diagnose his broken tractor while she was there. Henderson, having no other options, agreed. Martha drove the heavy, thundering machine out of her yard and down the county highway. When she arrived at the Henderson farm, the neighbors watched from their porches. They saw the young woman, covered in a heavy slicker against the rain, expertly maneuvering the old, resurrected iron through the thick, clinging mud. She worked from dawn until long after the sun went down, the headlights of the old tractor cutting through the darkness. The machine never faltered. The engine ran with the steady, unstoppable heartbeat of a locomotive, tearing through the difficult soil with ease. Within 3 days, Henderson's fields were fully prepped. Before she left, Martha spent 2 hours looking over Henderson's broken dealership tractor. Using the principles her father had taught her, she ignored the complex computer diagnostic port and listened to the mechanical linkages. She discovered a sheared pin in the steering linkage that was causing the safety sensors to lock the engine. She replaced the pin with a piece of hardened steel from her toolbox, bypassing the faulty sensor entirely. The expensive machine roared back to life. When Henderson paid her, his hands shook with gratitude. He had saved his planting season and avoided crippling debt, all thanks to the woman the town had laughed at. Word spreads quickly in a farming community, not through loud announcements, but through quiet conversations over fence lines and coffee cups. By the middle of summer, Martha had restored the 3rd and 4th tractors. She was no longer just the eccentric daughter of a dead mechanic. She was a lifeline. Demand for her mobile equipment service began to outpace her capacity to provide it. Farmers who were struggling under the weight of high-interest loans realized they did not need to buy new machinery to survive. They could hire Martha. They could hire her tough, reliable machines and her unparalleled mechanical expertise to get them through the harvest. Martha reinvested every single dollar she earned back into the operation. She did not buy a new truck or fancy clothes. She bought more abandoned equipment. She scoured the back roads and the forgotten barns of 3 counties, buying up broken implements, seized engines, and discarded iron for pennies on the dollar. She hauled them back to her yard, where she and the leather-bound journals went to work. As the 1980s approached, the economic climate of the country took a dark and violent turn. The era of easy credit evaporated overnight. Interest rates skyrocketed, choking the life out of the farms that had over-leveraged themselves. The agricultural crisis of the 1980s swept through the valley like a plague. Families who had farmed for generations were suddenly facing foreclosure. The shiny, air-conditioned tractors that Harlan Vance had sold them were being repossessed by the banks, dragged away in the middle of the night. The dealership lot, once a beacon of modern progress, became a stagnant pool of unsold, overpriced inventory. But Martha Gaines thrived. Because she carried zero debt, because her overhead was incredibly low, and because her machinery was fundamentally sound and easily repairable, she was immune to the financial storm tearing the county apart. In fact, the crisis accelerated her business. As farmers lost their expensive equipment, they turned entirely to Martha's mobile service to keep their land productive. She hired her first employee in 1982, a young mechanic who had lost his job at a failing auto shop. She taught him her father's methods, forcing him to abandon his reliance on replacement parts and teaching him to understand the soul of the metal. She expanded her fleet to 12 tractors, 3 combine harvesters, and a dozen heavy implements, all resurrected from the scrap heap. By 1986, what had begun as 5 laughed-at machines worth scrap value had become a $300,000 operation. Martha Gaines was employing 4 local mechanics, operating a fleet of heavy machinery across 3 counties, and saving dozens of family farms from total collapse by providing affordable, reliable mechanical power. Her yard, once a quiet sanctuary, was now a bustling hub of industry, filled with the constant roar of diesel engines and the sharp tang of welding smoke. The undeniable reality of her success could no longer be ignored by the establishment. The vindication came on a sweltering afternoon in late August. Martha was in the main workshop, instructing a new apprentice on the proper way to rebuild a hydraulic cylinder, when a pristine, expensive luxury car slowly crunched onto the gravel of her driveway. Harlan Vance stepped out of the car. He was an older man now, and the arrogant confidence that had once radiated from him was gone, replaced by the heavy, slumped posture of a man carrying a tremendous burden. His dealership was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, his lot full of machines no one could afford to buy, and his service department empty because the farmers could not afford his labor rates. Harlan walked slowly across the yard, stepping carefully over puddles of water and stray pieces of heavy chain. He looked at the fleet of tractors lined up ready for dispatch. He recognized the distinct, chalky red paint of the machines from the Miller Farm liquidation, now running smoothly under the hands of Martha's crew. He watched as a massive, restored combine harvester rumbled out of the gate, heading off to save another harvest. He stopped at the open door of the workshop and stood silently until Martha noticed him. She wiped her hands on a grease rag, her face impassive, and walked over to the doorway. The two of them stood there, separated by a few feet of concrete and a decade of history. Harlan looked at the dirt on her boots, then looked up into her eyes. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of unsaid apologies and undeniable truths. He finally spoke, his voice quiet and raspy. he asked her, with genuine broken curiosity, how she had known. He asked how she had looked at a pile of rusted junk that every expert in the state had condemned and seen a fortune waiting to be built. Martha did not gloat. She did not raise her voice or remind him of his cruel laughter in the mud 10 years prior. She looked at the man who represented everything her father had warned her against, the embodiment of shiny debt and disposable machinery. She pointed a grease-stained finger toward the heavy wooden workbench in the back of the shop, where the worn, leather-bound ledger lay open. She told him that the experts only listened to the sales brochures, but the land and the iron only listened to the truth. She explained that she had not built a business by outsmarting anyone. She had built a business by paying attention to the things that other men were too arrogant to value. Harlan Vance slowly nodded. He did not offer excuses or try to defend his crumbling empire. He simply reached out a trembling hand, offered a firm, respectful handshake, and admitted, out loud, that he had been entirely wrong about her and entirely wrong about the machines. He turned and walked back to his expensive car, a defeated king leaving the territory to the quiet master who had conquered it. The subsequent decades were a testament to the endurance of that quiet mastery. The 1990s and the turn of the new century brought massive technological changes to agriculture. Tractors became rolling computers, guided by satellites, and dependent on proprietary software that locked the farmers out of their own engines. The cycle of debt and dependency only deepened for those who chased the newest innovations. But Martha's operation remained a steadfast fortress of self-reliance. She eventually purchased hundreds of acres of prime farmland, buying it with cash generated from her service business. She did not buy the land to become a massive corporate farm. She bought it to preserve it, leasing it back to young families who wanted to farm the old way, free from the crushing grip of the banks. Today, Martha Gaines is an elder in the community, a woman whose name is spoken with deep, abiding reverence by anyone who makes their living from the soil. Her hair is silver, her hands are permanently scarred from a lifetime of wrestling with iron, but her eyes retain the sharp, observant clarity of the 24-year-old girl who stood in the mud at the Miller farm. She no longer goes out on the mobile service calls herself. She leaves that to the crew of mechanics she has trained over the years. Instead, you will find her in the expanded modern workshop that sits on the exact footprint of her father's old drafty barn. She spends her afternoons sitting at a sturdy oak desk, a young apprentice by her side. The apprentice is her grandnephew, a boy who possesses the same quiet patience she once did. They do not look at computer screens. They look at the worn, leather-bound ledgers of Elias Gaines, which now sit alongside several new volumes filled with Martha's own precise handwriting. She is teaching the boy the difference between a broken machine and a misunderstood one. She is teaching him how to diagnose a failing planetary gear by the pitch of its whine, and how to fabricate a replacement part when the factory tells you it cannot be done. She is passing the torch of ancestral wisdom, ensuring that the secret knowledge of the iron will survive another generation. Let me leave you with this final thought, a truth forged in the cold winters of 1978 and proven over a lifetime of patient labor. The world will always be full of men in clean suits and shiny showrooms who will tell you that the old ways are dead, that progress requires you to abandon your independence and embrace their debt. They will laugh at your frugality, they will mock your patience, and they will declare that the things you value are worthless scrap. The dealer told the county that those 5 machines were dead, and he built an empire on selling the cure. But his empire crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance, while the quiet woman in the denim jacket built a fortress out of the very iron he discarded. The dealer said to sell the farm and buy the future. She kept the iron, she honored the wisdom of her father, and the machinery remembered.